So the subject of what I want to talk to you about today is what I call technologically mediated performance. I will go into detail kind of about what I mean by that. It's a bit wordy, but I think it's kind of the most sort of accurate and succinct definition of what I do. And specifically, what I'm interested in kind of prompting you guys to think about is what happens when we start to incorporate computer systems into music performance, music making, music listening. So first, just a little bit of context about my role in the university, just to go into a little bit more detail. You can see from my corporate branding here, I'm in the School of Music, Theater, and Dance. That doesn't appear at all, so don't ever do yellow. Okay, there we go. So our school is divided into a bunch of departments. So we have things in the School of Music, Theater, and Dance like a piano department, a voice department, a string department, we have a dance department, theater, music theory, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We are actually a department called Performing Arts Technology, which is actually as fun as it sounds. We're kind of small. We have like 6 faculty. We have about 70 performing arts technology students. And we actually, the cool thing is we offer 4 different degrees, which is pretty amazing for a department this small. So we have a Bachelor of Music degree in Music and Technology, which is like our most kind of music-focused degree. It's like you take lessons and play an instrument. We have a BFA in Performing Arts Technology, which is music-focused. It has a kind of sister program that is more media-focused. And then we also offer a Bachelor of Science in Sound Engineering, which is pretty cool because students who do this program get a minor in electrical engineering just by virtue of doing our requirements. So it's kind of this music and engineering dual degree, really. So that's kind of the corporate line on what we do. This is my kind of mind map. I sat down and tried to think about everything that is kind of implicated in performing arts technology. So, music is at the center of everything that I do and that we do. And then I think we can sort of go out radially from there and think about areas like sound engineering that involve mixing, mastering, recording, composition, which can be, in the context of concert music, in the context of film or music for visual media, video games, or kind of pop music as well, which overlaps then with engineering in terms of production. And most of our students want to be a producer when they come in, and then we have to kind of convince them that there's sort of no such thing anymore. But that's a different story. Heavy focus on computer science, programming. Some people are really interested in using things like artificial intelligence to look at how computer systems can compose music themselves. Areas like mobile and embedded music. So we have some colleagues that are working on making music with mobile phones. We actually have a mobile phone ensemble. I don't know, has anyone ever heard of this or been to a concert? Yeah, so that's happening. Then we get into engineering. Psychology seems a little less obvious, but anytime as you guys are probably learning, anytime you deal with new media, psychology kind of becomes integrally implicated. And that's actually one of my kind of primary research areas. And then performance, which is kind of the focus of what I want to talk about. So questions like what happens when instruments and electronics become involved together. Looking at performance practice. So how do you develop a kind of a practice like what a violinist does when you're dealing with an interactive system? It becomes a very different kind of thing. So I guess the kind of fundamental question that I have in the background here is, what does it mean to perform music with a computer? I guess by what does it mean, I'm really talking about the kind of consequences of what happens what's different about music when a computer becomes involved? There are kind of obviously musical consequences, but there are a lot of other kinds of consequences. I wonder, as specific or as general as you want to be, I'm wondering if anyone could speculate on what kinds of consequences there are when we start involving computers. Any thoughts? What changes when all of a sudden a computer replaces a musical instrument? Oh, come on.
Of like human error, like everything can be on rhythm or on exactly.
Yeah, that's a really interesting topic, and in fact, that specific topic of error, of making mistakes, is something I've been working on. So yeah, that's kind of a musical consequence, in the sense of like the nature of music changes when it's perfect. But it's also a social consequence, because if you think about the relationship between music performers and music listeners, the nature of that relationship that you have, which is kind of built on trust and authenticity, when I'm on stage playing a violin, there's this kind of social contract that I have with the audience that I'm not cheating, I'm not faking it, I'm really working hard. And of course, there's all kinds of cultural studies that have happened about, oh God, you guys are all probably way too young to remember Milli Vanilli. Does anyone remember Milli Vanilli? No? Okay. Grammy Award winning Best New Artist circa late 80s, like 89 or something, and then promptly, thereafter were exposed for not singing any of the songs on their albums. So the guys that you saw on stage were essentially mime and lip sync artists. So they had to return their Grammy Awards, and there's been some great research about all this. There's that kind of social trust that was violated, in part by the illusion that you can create with computers. But there was also an interesting cultural consequence, too, that happened. So has anyone ever heard of MTV Unplugged? Yeah, so you've all probably heard like the Nirvana Unplugged album, which was a major musical, cultural revolution. That MTV Unplugged started the year after the Milli Vanilli fiasco, in part as this kind of cultural response to this question of authenticity in music. So the idea was, we put musicians in this situation where they absolutely can't fake it, as a way, in a way, the part of the recording industry to kind of restore that social contract that we have with performers. So those are some of the kinds of consequences that I'm interested in, which again range to musical, technological, social, or cultural consequences. As I said, the kind of questions that are implicit in this are things like, how does music change when a computer is involved? The question of skill is, I think, wrapped up in error, right? How do we know when someone is a really good computer performer? It's hard to know, in fact. And so there's a lot of, I think there's interesting work to be done in how do we actually communicate what's happening between a performer and an audience. This other kind of consequence of how do audiences actually, take in the sonic and visual information that they're processing and use it to make sense of, what am I experiencing as a performance here? How much is the person doing? How much is the computer doing? What's the relationship between the human and the computer? So I think this is a kind of distilled sort of disciplinary map of everything that becomes involved, in performing arts technology. So although we're kind of in the music school, in the School of Music, Theater, and Dance, we have this very multidisciplinary perspective. I guess one of the interesting things about having this multidisciplinary perspective and this multidisciplinary nature is that each of these fields, which is something that you're all probably starting to learn and understand, each of these fields has a set of norms and of practices and of accepted methods for how to investigate problems. In academia we talk about methodologies, and each each field kind of has a set of methodologies that are accepted, that when you're communicating within that field, everyone understands how you go about doing things, what's the right way to solve a problem. So when I ask this question of, what does it mean to perform music with a computer, there are different kinds of answers to that question depending on what disciplinary perspective you're looking at. To an engineer, that can be a technological question, right? There are engineering solutions to that, and there's engineering methods that we can use to answer that question. Similarly, there are psychological methods that we can use, methods from the humanities, which will typically involve, studying history and writing and constructing verbal arguments. But there are also kind of creative solutions to the problem. And so what I want to mostly kind of try to get across to you today is the way that, partly in my work, but more kind of generally, historically, and broadly in the field, how researchers kind of rely on different methods from different fields and actually kind of synthesize different methods. Typically kind of, more conventional, researchy, written experimental methods with creative methods. And I think this is a kind of contemporary academic problem. As you start to see interdisciplinary fields emerge, like performing arts technology, like what we do, we need to be able to kind of not just borrow from different disciplines, but actually integrate the methods and the practices of different disciplines meaningfully to kind of surround these multidisciplinary problems. So I think what I want to kind of mostly do is give you some examples of different kind of issues that emerge and look at how the synthesis of kind of written argument and creative argument can work together to try to address the challenges of our field. To give you a sense of the kind of diversity, again, I've sort of said this 3 times now, how many different things are involved. This is the kind of list off the top of my head of recent topics that I've worked on. So as was mentioned, my PhD work was about trying to synthesize the sounds of whales and dolphins, which involved looking at dead whale parts, which was kind of grim and fascinating. They all died of natural causes. And it stinks like hell. But it's actually interesting because anatomists don't really understand how whales and dolphins make the sounds that they make, but they make some of the most interesting sounds in nature. So I kind of found this out and said, well, has anyone tried to computationally model these mechanisms that we're all fighting about and see if they actually make sound? So that's kind of what I did for one of the parts that you see in a dolphin. Looking at building new musical interfaces for performance, this question of skill. I've done a little bit of work on mobile phones, the history of computer music, which is kind of my main written output right now, and some of these other things that I'm going to talk about in a little more detail. So, as I said, one of the things that's emerged recently in my work has been a bit by necessity, having become somewhat of a historian of computer music. And so that has kind of informed the way that I see writing and creative practice coming together. So I want to provide a little bit, because this field is probably a little bit, if not entirely unfamiliar to most of you, I want to give you a little bit of historical context for this question of what happens when we start combining technologies and music. So, poll, what is the noisiest music you listen to? You can give me genres, artists. Thank you. Drill music. Yes, that's it. Okay. So this is like a kind of club genre, right? Underground club genre. Combining rap with, and so what's noisy about it? The sounds? Noise-based recorded sounds that they're incorporating. Okay, that's good. Okay, what do I mean by noise? Maybe that's a stumbling block here. Okay, so generally in music we kind of contrast noise with tonal sounds. So you had a hand up. Did you want to?
Oh, I don't know. Are you talking about noise or sound? Because I feel like there's a difference between noise and there's a difference between the term sound.
I'm sorry. Can you speak up a
noise
little bit?
and sound. Like
Yeah, noise as contrasted with.
When I think of noise, I think of like sort of disruptive almost, just like the connotations with that word. So I don't know if that's what you're.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a really good point. There is a difference in between a kind of cultural and social definition of noise and a kind of sonic definition of noise. So, socially when we talk about noise, we think about disruption. We think about something that is kind of unwanted. And if you think about that musically, that's kind of how noise emerged as this contrast from, pure sounding notes that you get from a melodic instrument like a piano or a flute or something like that versus something that doesn't have a pitch to it or a tone to it. So they're kind of related in this maybe like etymological way, in that when we talk about noise in music, we're talking about something that was originally maybe seen as disruptive, but was then kind of co-opted into music. Okay, so now with that understanding, what do you listen to that has noise in it? Yes? Spanish pop music. Awesome. Such as who? Name an artist. Enrique, okay. That's cool. Let's go with Enrique Iglesias. What is noisy in Enrique Iglesias' music? His voice. How's his voice noisy? He sings a lot. So he makes a lot of sound. He's like really active. Yeah, cool. So that's interesting because his voice is noisy in a lot of different ways. His voice is noisy in contrast to the way an operatic singer would sing, in that pop singers generally try to have a kind of rasp to their voice, which gives this kind of interesting soulful kind of expression to it. So in that way, like an operatic singer would probably say his voice is noisy, and then the beats that he's making have noise in them. Yeah. So in fact, kind of we could probably do this analysis on any kind of music that we listen to today, and pretty much drill down into the fact that it's all pretty damn noisy. When do we think noise started becoming an important part of music? Historically. Guesses? Grunge. So like 90s, early 90s, grunge. Yeah. That's an interesting point. It certainly, when grunge emerged, everyone knows who I'm talking about with grunge, yeah. Artists like Pearl Jam, Nirvana, the kind of West Coast bands of the early 90s. Distorted guitars, that kind of like almost screaming texture to the voices. So anyone think that noise started emerging much earlier? Starting to use everyday sounds in classical music. Yeah, that's a good one. And in fact, that's kind of where I want to go. Other kind of important historical times when noise emerged. A lot of people talk about Jimi Hendrix. Any Hendrix fans here? So Jimi Hendrix, what did he do that was important? With the electric guitar. Yeah, what did he do with it? Yeah. So Hendrix took the electric guitar, which existed and emerged basically to make the guitar audible in jazz big bands, right? That's how the electric guitar emerged. You had this big band that had a bunch of trumpets, and it had a drum kit in it, and you couldn't hear a guitar. So Les Paul decided we'll make the guitar louder. Then Hendrix took it and he started playing with feedback. He started overdriving his amplifiers so that it would actually deliberately distort the sound, which is something that we kind of just accept as part of as part of the sound of an electric guitar these days. But that wasn't always the case. So Hendrix did it. There were certainly other rock artists that did it as well. So this is a quotation from Luigi Russolo, who was a member of a group of kind of revolutionaries known as the Italian Futurists. So in 1913, he said, "We must enlarge and enrich more and more the domain of musical sounds. This need and this tendency can be totally realized only through the joining and substituting of noises to and for musical sounds." So he's really advocating taking what we considered as music in 1913 and replacing the kind of conventionally musical elements with noises. This was interesting because that's exactly what he went and did. He created, along with the designer, a set of instruments that were called the intona rumori, the noise instruments. And they were these kind of mechanical devices that had mostly hand cranks on them, and they made noise. And they were designed to take the place of musical instruments in a concert setting. It wasn't very successful. Popularly, most of the concerts ended in riots and with fruit and vegetables being thrown. They presented a series of 12 concerts in London. This was like right at the outbreak of World War I. Generally, these were hated. Here is, the original instruments were lost, but they've been reconstructed. So this is actually a composition for which there was a score that he created. You would probably imagine if you were a concert-going audience in London or Rome, in the 19-teens, he was accustomed to like Italian opera and symphonic music. You'd be pretty aghast by that as well. But what's interesting is that in order to start incorporating noise, he had to resort to technological means to do that. This becomes pervasive in music, starting around that time. Okay, so that was Ballet Mécanique. The music was by the American composer George Antheil. It was a collaboration with French artist and filmmaker Léger. There are sirens in the score. There are airplane propellers in the score that are supposed to be brought on stage and spun to make those kind of noisy, whirring sounds. There's a few things that are kind of important here. One is that this becomes a tendency, and it's a feature of modernism. Has anyone encountered modernism in other classes, or history classes, or anything like that? A little bit? Okay. The kind of hallmark of modernism is a sense that everything about humanity, including the arts, should be constantly progressing. And there's this notion of progress which encapsulates this idea that what humanity is creating, whether it's artistic or technological or cultural, should be of the time that we're living in. And so this impulse to involve noise in music and to involve technology in music comes from this kind of overwhelming sense of disconnect between, the concert music of the 19th century and the kind of modern era in the early part of the 20th century, which is characterized by war, by industry, by urban life, and by a kind of dirty, noisy environment that everyone was living in. Modernists were also really interested in combining different art forms, at looking at artworks as these kind of total experiences, these immersive experiences. And which is why you start to see experimental filmmaking and music happening at the same time. And really kind of drives the push toward incorporating media and technology into music making. So another composer, Edgar Varèse, who is a Frenchman living in New York, similarly wrote, along with, not connected to Rousselot, but kind of alongside Rousselot, this kind of advocating this idea of needing a new repertoire of sounds and a repertoire of musical instruments. So Rousselot, I should mention, wrote this volume along with the other group of futurists called the Futurist Manifesto, which was this fantastic, it's really worth reading because it's this totally antiquated style of writing where you kind of list your demands and you write a manifesto. No one even writes manifestos anymore. But it's kind of this like vision of a future which is characterized by industry, by speed, by war. The futurists kind of unfortunately became tied up in fascism during the war. They really kind of glorified and celebrated everything about industry, which included war. And similarly, Varèse was kind of a prolific writer, but in order to kind of give any teeth to their visions, they felt the need, however unsuccessfully, to exercise them creatively as well. So Varèse was involved in the Philips Pavilion, which was created at the 1958 Brussels World Fair. The interesting thing about this is that this pavilion was designed by Le Corbusier, who is a French modernist architect, and Yanis Xenakis, who is a composer. So you don't often have composers designing buildings, but Xenakis worked in Le Corbusier's studio, and in fact the shape of the building reflected Xenakis' compositional ideas at the time. And Varèse created music that was to be played inside of this pavilion over hundreds of loudspeakers that were attached to the walls, and you can kind of see these bumps here. This is a kind of inside photograph of the slope of that roof that had these hundreds of loudspeakers on it, and there were these film projections on almost every surface inside of the pavilion. And so he created this piece of electronic music, which was one of the most important early pieces of electronic music, not because it's particularly great musically, but because of the context in which it was created and which it was presented. So let me know what you guys think of this. There is my cursor. Whoops. Fly into this. Wait. There it is. Okay, I think over there. There we go. Okay. Upon hearing this again, I have to say I didn't give this piece enough credit. It's actually great. But we see Perez, in a way, kind of putting his money where his mouth is in terms of going out and doing what he's advocating. So here he is combining real-world recorded sounds, those bells that you heard. He's combining abstract sounds, these kind of non-specific noises. He's combining machine-created sounds, those kind of synthesized tones that were made on really early synthesizer. And he's treating them as musical materials. So you hear these motives that emerge, that little squeaky sound that repeats, just like kind of a musical phrase repeats. So he's really kind of preserving in a way the form, the conventions of music, structuring material over time and repeating it and developing it. He's making music, but kind of just replacing the vocabulary, right? Just kind of replacing the conventional sounds that we're used to hearing with things that are kind of more modern, more of this time, things that are made by machines, things that reflect our daily experience. And presenting it accordingly in this kind of radical new context. It's in this giant building accompanied by all these film projections over hundreds of loudspeakers. So I guess the kind of point I want to get across is that the achievements of these 20th century musical visionaries really need to be considered in an intellectual context. If you were to hear this piece with no context, it would just kind of be baffling and it would be difficult to make sense. And if you were to read his writing without hearing the music, it would just kind of be sort of a vacuous thought exercise. It's only when we start considering the synthesis of the intellectual framework that he's trying to create and the musical instantiation of it, however successful or not, that we can start to really understand the questions that he's asking and the argument that he's trying to make. I want to give just one more historical example, and probably because he's the best known of the kind of 20th century musical radicals, and that's John Cage. Has anyone ever encountered John Cage or his music? Yeah? What's John Cage's most famous piece, anyone? So John Cage is most famous for creating this piece called 4 minutes and 33 seconds. It's also known as the silent piece. So it's a piece in 3 movements to be performed by any instrument. It was originally premiered by the pianist David Tudor, who's one of the most important pianists of the 20th century, who got on stage, sits down at the piano, closes the lid of the piano. Or sorry, no, he opens the lid of the piano and then waits and plays nothing for, the first movement is about a minute long, and then he closes the lid and resets himself, and then he opens the lid and does the same thing for about 2 minutes and 40 seconds, so the whole piece is silent. And there's actually a score that just basically has the word tacit, which in musical language means make no sound. So it's 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. That's Cage's kind of most famous composition. Before Cage was obsessed, yes?
What's the significance of like the silent piece? Like what was so groundbreaking about it?
Yeah, well, I'll get there in 1 second. And then I'd like to talk about it more if you're unsatisfied with the answer. Before Cage was interested in silence, like the other modernists, he was very interested in noise. In the 1930s, he started composing percussion music. This is all just percussion. This is a conventionally notated score, just played by regular instruments. So I should say that the kind of first answer before technology to when does noise start to appear in music is percussion, actually. A lot of people would be surprised to know that at least in Western music tradition, percussion music didn't exist until the 20th century. There were kind of timpanis and snare drums used in orchestral pieces, but in Western European concert music, there's no piece composed only for percussion instruments until 1911, and that was actually by Varese, the composer that did the piece in the pavilion. So the first kind of impulse to add noise to music was to kind of imitate the sounds of the natural world by using percussion instruments, and then with technology, why not just make them directly? Cage, though, kind of gave up on this obsession with noise that we saw. He was, as well as a composer, he was a prolific writer. He was a scholar of Buddhism, a scholar of Indian music, and he kind of became disillusioned with this pursuit of novelty, this pursuit of, we need to make new sounds, we need to always kind of be reflecting what's going on in the world. And after 1948, his compositional practice became this obsession, moving from noise towards silence. And it was kind of this pursuit of purity, because to Cage, silence was the frame in which music can happen. So, if we think of music, the most basic definition of music is events in time. Music's most fundamental characteristic is that it happens over time. One thing happens, from one moment to the next, and what a composer does is kind of control what happens in a frame of time. So the most essential quality of music, then, is not sound, which is what we kind of conventionally think, oh, music's about sound. To Cage, the most fundamental quality of music is silence, because without that kind of frame of silence over time, there can be no music, right? Silence is the kind of most essential quality, and then sound is what happens within that frame. And so the silent piece is kind of historically seen as not the most successful explication of this, because, for a lot of reasons. But it's the one that's kind of been appropriated the most, I guess, by media and popular culture. But what's significant to Cage is that he stops concerning himself with specifically what happens in music in time. And he becomes obsessed with this idea of chance, of simply creating a temporal structure in which things happen, which is silence, and then starting to detach himself from the specifics of what happens in that temporal frame. So one reading of 4 minutes and 33 seconds is that the composition is all of the sound that happens ambiently in that silent 4 minutes and 33 seconds, right? If we were to perform that piece right now, you would hear that rattling HVAC, you'd hear this really annoying wind sound up here, you'd hear people typing on their keyboards, you'd hear someone coughing. You would hear all of that, and you could consider that, if you were not excessively concerned about the particular qualities of sound that happen, you can certainly experience all of that as music. So that was what Cage did, and like others, he turned to technology as one way to achieve that. So the first technology that he used was coin flipping. So he used the I Ching, which is this ancient Chinese text for divination, for predicting the future, and devised a method of flipping coins, or actually used an existing method of flipping coins to generate randomness, and then apply that randomness to musical qualities. Subsequently, he got access to computers and started running computer simulations of the I Ching in order to generate these random structures. But he also turned to technology to create random sounds. And one of the most compelling ways to me that he did this was in this piece, Imaginary Landscape number 4, which is a series of events that unfold over time, and those events are different tunings and loudnesses on 12 radios that are played by 24 performers. So there are 24 performers, 2 per radio, 1 adjusting the tuning and 1 adjusting the volume of the radio. And of course, what's brilliant about this is that you have no way of predicting what it's going to be on any given radio station, in any given place, or at any given time. And furthermore, what I think is just incredible is that if you perform this piece when it was written in 1951, or you perform it today, it is going to qualitatively sound completely different, in the sense that it's kind of this mirror on culture, on what is the sound of our time, right? And probably in 50 or 60 years, when AM radio disappears, this was written for AM radio, the piece will change entirely because there'll be basically only noise or static or silence. So this is a recent performance of Imaginary Landscape 4. That was Foreigner that he was keeping score. Okay. I could actually, I don't know about you, I could really listen to that piece all day. I want to kind of jump ahead and use this, everything we just talked about as a kind of frame to consider some of the things that I'm working on and some of the kind of more modern or more contemporary, I guess, less modern, more contemporary challenges of incorporating computer systems now into music technology. So the first area is that of using advanced computer networks. So there's been this kind of explosion of work in recent days of using dedicated research networks that connect pretty much all of the major research universities in the United States with ridiculously high bandwidth and ridiculously low transit times, and using this infrastructure to make music. And again, kind of answering this question of what are the consequences of this? What are the musical consequences? What are the cultural consequences, the social consequences? What are the possibilities of what we can do when we start playing music with people that are in distant locations, supported by these networks. So there have been a bunch of people involved in this work. I've been involved to varying degrees. The New World Symphony, which is directed by Michael Tilson Thomas, who's the conductor of the San Francisco Symphony, has been kind of heavily involved as a kind of music institution. Researchers at Rensselaer Polytechnic and at Stanford that I've been working with. So there's this thing called Internet 2, which is pretty insane. This is a draft of a plan that has kind of gone into place. I don't know exactly what it looks like, but this is 100 gigabit network connection between all of these nodes across the map. So that's really fast. You know, good quality home internet gives you 50 megabits. So this is like, what is that, 4 or 5 orders of magnitude faster than kind of your home internet connection. This is about the same, 5 orders of magnitude higher than like the wireless connection that you have in this room. So of course you can use it to stream a lot of YouTube, but we're kind of more interested in streaming a lot of music and streaming all this music between people in different locations as quickly as possible. So why is as quickly as possible important when we're talking about music? Yeah, you had, what's that? Delay, yeah. Music is a temporal phenomenon, right? Music, if I'm playing, you know, in a band with you, music kind of depends on us sharing a sense of time. We need to know that, you know, our events, or the sounds that we're making, or the sounds that we're not making, are kind of aligned in time. And so as high as the bandwidth is in this network, it still takes time for you know, electrons to move down a wire, which are ultimately carrying this data. So the kind of first question that we started to ask when we started playing with this was, you know, again, thinking about what does this mean for music making, was what happens when musicians try to play together and there's delay between them? So we ran this kind of pioneering study back at Stanford that these two rooms are not actually in San Francisco and New York. We just called them that. They're like adjacent rooms in a recording studio. And we had 2 subjects. We brought in a bunch of human subjects. So again, thinking about different kind of methods of different disciplines, we brought in a bunch of human subjects and we had them play this little rhythm. So, you know, like subject A goes, and then subject B goes. And so they interlock. And we then, with a computer, we varied the time of travel of the signal from, you know, San Francisco's microphone to New York's ear and vice versa. Okay, so we had all these different delay conditions. And then we looked at what happened. So before I get into the kind of scientific answer of what happened, there was an interesting social consequence, which we had to actually, in a pilot, we had to control for, because we ran this with 2 undergraduate researchers as the subjects, and they started fighting with each other because they started blaming each other for screwing up. And in fact, they were doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing, but the delay was causing them to like slow down, which is what happens. So we had to like include in our protocol this whole like thing about, you know, anything that happens is going to be perfectly natural, and it's not anyone's fault if it all goes wrong. And still, you know, it was kind of an amazing on a social level. We never really wrote about that, but it was just kind of funny. So we had them kind of do this over and over with different delay conditions, and we can kind of make this map where we look at where their events line up in time. And here, this is kind of what it looks like when they slow down. You can see there's this kind of this spread, like if you look at when this event happens and when this happens in time, that these things are supposed to be exactly lined up. So this is kind of the map of what happens when they're slowing, when they're slowing down. This is kind of like average conditions. That's kind of bad, slowing down. This is pretty steady. And one of the really interesting things that we discovered is that when there's very little delay between the performers, they actually speed up, which is pretty cool. And the only explanation we really have is that sound travels about a foot per millisecond in air. So 3 milliseconds delay is like about me clapping 3 feet from your ear. We were able to do 0 delay, which is like me clapping in your head, which is not a kind of realistic musical situation. So we think that people actually naturally expect there to be some delay, and they kind of inherently adjust for that. So this was kind of a kind of interesting study that we wrote up in this psychology journal called Perception. So this is looking at that kind of leading or lagging behavior, and at very low delays, it's in fact positives, which means, so the positive side of this graph means that they're actually speeding up. They're like ahead of when the other person's clapping. And there's this almost really nicely linear decay in which people slow down at 78 milliseconds. The good news is for us is that at around 20 milliseconds, people can sustain a pretty steady tempo. And so this is like the travel time from Ann Arbor on a realistic network of audio data. So we can play with someone in New York live over the internet. So the bandwidth is not at all an issue. We can send dozens and dozens of channels of audio. So we could have 2 big bands playing together with 1 microphone and a discrete audio signal per instrumentalist, and have plenty of bandwidth to do that. But the time is the kind of critical thing. And the cool thing is that to New York, where there's an Internet 2 node, we can do that in an amount of time where we can sustain a pretty steady tempo. Going to Australia is a very different and interesting question in itself, because it suggests that we need to start to consider how we're going to change the music that we play if we're going to try to collaborate in real time with musicians. Because precise synchronization of the kind that's required for chamber music or jazz or anything like that isn't going to happen between here and Japan or between here and Australia, ever. These speeds are about 80% of the speed of light, or these delays represent about 80% of the speed of light. So we're pretty much pushing on physical limits. So even if we were to go the speed of light, the delay of the sound to get here over a network to Australia is too long to ever play rhythmic music. So that then becomes a kind of fascinating question to me, is how does music have to change, and how does the social and cultural exchange between musicians change when we have this kind of network that has an inherent delay in the way? And we can answer part of the question with science, right? We can use methods from psychology and from engineering to kind of start to poke at, okay, these are the things we can do, these are the things we can't do, these are the limits of human performance. Another way that I wasn't involved in this research, but these folks at Stanford that I was working with at the time had the St. Lawrence String Quartet, which is one of the premier string quartets in the world. They were in Banff in Alberta, and they had one member, actually an additional member, so they were playing as a quintet at Stanford. And they were trying to play real chamber music. So this is very different than this kind of clapping study, because we weren't playing music when we were clapping. And this is kind of, a different way to ask this question. Is, well, let's just try it and see what happens. So, just the musicians talking to each other over the network. Okay, so that was supposed to be a steady tempo. That was the cellist in Alberta and the violist at Stanford, and they're supposed to be going dun, 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 dun. And because one was waiting for the other and the other was waiting for the one, and vice versa, it has this kind of beautiful, retardando that you can't even get, if you're trying. They tried it again. And they kind of arrived at this tempo that they could actually sustain, which is cool. So that kind of tempo plateaus, sort of, but in an impossible way. So then they tried it again. Then they tried it again and said, okay, let's just not pay attention to what each other's doing. Oops.
Yeah, I'm gonna just play it with this.
Yeah, and I'll play it, I'll steal it.
So they can sustain a tempo, but it's really sloppy, right? They're never synchronized because, and this is kind of like, we learned something really interesting about musicians, right? Which is that the time scale on which we process the sound that we're hearing and anticipate what someone else is doing is so fine and so precise that even that, I don't know what they had, like 50 milliseconds or something of delay there, 50 milliseconds is tiny, right? That's a really short amount of time, but we need that amount of time in order to be able to process the time between someone else's events and adjust ourselves accordingly. So that they can kind of cope and do something that, you know, they would never be satisfied with, certainly in a concert. So I wanted to show you the way that I kind of, after, you know, engaging in some of this research, a little bit of the way that I decided to engage in this question of networks. And maybe I'll just play this video a little bit, oops, before I talk about robots. It's not going to sound so great in here. So I'll just fill in a little bit of the context here. So there were 3 different spaces, one in Ireland, one in France, one in California. Each of them had about 32 loudspeakers, which allow us to really precisely control the apparent trajectory of a sound. And so each room had these 4 microphones, and in each space visitors could come, and if they talked into the microphone or they sang or they whistled, nothing happened. Only if they whispered into the microphone would their sound be captured, and then it would be looped. And it would, as it looped, it would play in the loudspeakers and it would move in the room as if it were traveling in the direction of one of these other spaces. So if you were in Ireland and the sound was going toward France, you'd hear it kind of moving in the southward direction in the space. If it were going to California, you'd hear it moving west. And so you heard the sound of your voice and the sound of these other people's voices that were being looped. And gradually traveling in space. If you were in a remote space, you would hear that travel as well. So you'd hear someone else's voice moving in the same direction towards you. So this piece, you know, in it I tried to play with kind of a lot of the themes that I've been talking about. You heard those kind of radiostatic sounds, which was a bit of an homage to John Cage. Played with noise in the sense that whispered sound is really noisy. And it also played with this idea of location and dislocation that we get when we're connected with people over a network. Networks create this kind of anonymity in the sense that you don't really perceive in the same way where someone is in a space. So I tried to kind of reflect that in the idea of this sound traveling. And the fact that you could hear, you know, what other people were doing in a distant location kind of in real time and not be able to see them or kind of know who they are. And that was also then reflected in this kind of whisper a message kind of quality to it. But also with this idea of, you know, thinking about consequences of computers and music technology, of making audiences responsible for the performance of a piece, which is something that we now increasingly have the ability to do. You know, you can't necessarily invite a random audience member up to, you know, play a piano at a piano concerto, but one of the kind of cool things I think that's liberating and democratizing about music technology is the ability to invite people to participate. And that was something I kind of really wanted to achieve. So in this case, the people there are, you know, just people who are invited into the spaces and become responsible for the composition themselves. All I'm doing in this kind of Cagean way is creating the frame for it to happen, but any sound that's going to happen in the piece, you know, they have to generate. So I guess I should stop there. I won't get to my last research topic, but I think this is a really nice natural place to close. I guess that puts me right on 10 till. I don't know if there are any questions we can talk about quickly or comments or I don't have any particular discussion questions for you, but if you have questions for me about anything, I'm happy to. Yeah.
Do you think the creative process behind making music is like facilitated by being able to like work through huge instances, or is it worse because you don't have to be in the same room with each other like library?
Yes and yes. It's better. So the question is about you know, how does the music creation process change? You know, with the network, I think with networks in general, you know, the internet is kind of a facilitating factor as well. So yes, it's cool because you can collaborate with people that you can't otherwise collaborate with, which is something that we're seeing in different ways, both in this performative sense, but you know, I've had some of our undergraduate applicants that we've been interviewing. One was telling me about this you know, dance music he's been making with a producer in New York who he's never met, has never spoken to, but they have this, you know, online sharing technology. Basically, they're using SoundCloud to send each other tracks that they're kind of editing and adding to. And so that's amazing that, you know, this kind of ability is facilitated. In performance, it's really different, and that is kind of has been a negative experience for me in some ways, because it's hard to get people, it's hard to communicate a creative vision when you have this giant kind of media block in between you. You know, there's so much of musical communication and of just human communication that happens, and when we're in a room, that is impeded by technologies as amazing as they are, that becomes difficult to overcome. Cool. Thanks everyone for your attention.